Well, hello, guys. We'll pick up where we left off last week. I showed you expressionism was kind of the primary topic, that and Fauvism, which is kind of an expressionism. Today, I want to talk about Cubism and what comes after Cubism. And Cubism and Picasso, synonymous. And so, a lot of people consider Picasso the greatest artist of the 20th century. Some of that's debatable, but what we have here is a guy who was a child prodigy. His parents were art teachers. He was very gifted. There are drawings available, and you can see this online if you care to. Some of his drawings from the time he was like 10, 12 years old were phenomenally good. And so he was kind of the golden boy kid. And then, because like what most artists did at that time, he went to Paris. As I said earlier, Paris was the center of European Western culture. And so anyway, he goes there, and his career is kind of followed. And he was very prolific. He died like in 1972, lived to be very old. And because he was kind of, as I was saying, considered probably to be the best painter, the artistic genius of the century, his career was followed. And so we got a lot of information on him, a lot of criticism, a lot of theory, a lot of analysis. But in his early period in Paris, they call this the Rose period. And they call it that because he used a lot of reds. They were basically kind of warm colors. They call it the Rose period. And he was kind of like a lot of the French artists. He was kind of interested in the ordinary people doing ordinary things. And this is the family of saltimbanques, which means that they were circus people. And so these are ordinary people, ordinary things. And probably you could take that a step further. They were probably more like outcast than just ordinary people. But anyway, and you can see he's picking up on some of the ideas that we've talked about this brushwork being very upfront, in your face, asserted. This is a painting. This is brushwork. And so anyway, this is an early Picasso Rose period. And as I was talking about the idea of Paris being the center of all of this artistic, literary, scientific, technological engineering, the Eiffel Tower, so on and so on. There was this woman, Gertrude Stein. She was a poet. She was a novelist. She went to Paris, and she kind of threw parties and was kind of the social director among a lot of these very famous people of the time. And so I did this Bing search. Gertrude Stein was an American novelist, poet, playwright, and art collector, born in Pittsburgh in the Allegheny West neighborhood and raised in Oakland, California. She moved to Paris in 1903 and made France her home for the remainder of her life. She hosted a Paris salon where the leading figures of modernism in literature and art, such as Pablo Picasso, Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Sinclair Lewis, Ezra Pound, Sherwood Anderson, and Henri Matisse would meet. So anyway, she was kind of like right in the middle of all of this artistic, literary genius. And so here's a picture. It's a photo of young Pablo. And this is his studio. And it's kind of interesting to see the stuff he has in his studio. This becomes kind of an issue with Picasso, a point of contention to some. But at any rate, I put the star by this one. Actually, I have a poster of this in my living room from a Picasso show that was showing at the National Gallery in Paris in 1953. So anyway, it's an exhibition poster, but bottom line is, look at what's going on with the picture. This is where Picasso breaks out. He does a rose period, he does a blue period, and then he does something that's very different than what anybody did before. And that is that he starts breaking up the images and putting them back together on the surface. We saw Cezanne, and he kind of stacked the images and put things together in his own way. And that really inspired a lot of the early Cubists, that was really something you could do, is take your subject matter apart and put it together any way you like. Now, this particular piece, the Demoiselles of Avignon, refers to these women, these sex workers in a brothel. And the way that they are portrayed, a lot of people have analyzed this painting and seem to feel that this is very antagonistic towards women. It's not flattering. And in fact, they look kind of menacing. And there are, you can add to that, like the melon here. It's very sharp. It looks like it could be a weapon. The angles look very disconcerting. But probably more than all of that is these two faces. And these are derived from African masks. And it had been documented that when Picasso was a young man in Spain, there was an exhibition in his hometown where he was exposed to African art. Well, there's something to that. And earlier in this course, I talked about colonization, how that affected what was going on. And we saw the influence from other cultures, start to appear in European art. Certainly the Japanese influence was very prevalent in post-impressionist art. People like Van Gogh and Toulouse-Lautrec and so on really understood what those artists of Japan were doing. Picasso looks to African artists. And of course, they're not exactly replicas. They're not faithful renditions of African art, but the idea of how African artists, and that's kind of a generalized term because the continent of Africa is big, it's vast, there are many different cultures, and to just say African is kind of too vague. But bottom line, a lot of their cultures, they geometricized their images, especially in wood carvings. And so the geometry, the geometric characteristics is really what you start to see appear. And Picasso at least theorized that the geometry was really kind of part and parcel to what he was trying to do with Cubism. Take the images apart, put them back together on his terms. Essentially, he liked to keep his work flat areas of color, not really a whole lot of modeling, although you see little tiny bits of that. And as I was saying, it being a point of contention, there has been much discussion on, is this influence or is this somehow plagiarism? Is Picasso taking the work of African artists and appropriating it without paying the due respect to the original intent of the original art? So anyway, Demoiselles of Avignon, and you can see this is at the Museum of Modern Art. It's pretty big. It's 8 feet by 7 feet 8 inches. It's one of their prize paintings in the MoMA collection. And one of the things that happens in this development of Cubism is that Picasso runs into this guy, Georges Braque. And they really start to develop this idea of taking the images, breaking them up, fracturing them, and putting them back together. And so that's what we have here. And this is called analytic cubism because it's basically taking your subject matter and analyzing it and putting it back together. Analytic cubism is almost all achromatic. That is, it doesn't have color. Well, you might say, well, look, there's some browns and some other kinds of warm color. What can I say? In terms of the color wheel, in terms of the vocabulary, gray, white, and black are not colors. They are values, they are tones, if you will. But anyway, they're typically this kind of brown, black, and white in terms of their coloration. And as I was saying about taking all of this apart and putting it back together, if you look very carefully, you can see some bits and pieces, fragments of images. And so you see here part of a guitar, the sound hole, the strings. You can see up here a profile, someone's face. You can see little bits and pieces of things that are in some ways not discernible. You don't know what they are. And finally, you see letters and numbers. And they really kind of like throwing that stuff in the analytic cubism, partly because it was flat. And the idea being that these guys were really like their predecessors, making flat paintings on the belief that illusionistic space was a lie. You don't do that. It's just not about fooling the eye. It's about truth. It's about veracity. It's about being a painting that shouts, this is a painting. This is not a trick. It is not, and Picasso often called illusionistic painting a lie. It is not a lie. And so Braque and Picasso painted side by side for a number of years in the early decades of the 20th century. Here is a Picasso from that period. And what they kind of start to do, it says still life with chair caning. I don't know if you guys know about chair caning. Old chairs, a lot of them, the seats and the back were cut out. And this stuff, this caning, was essentially rope woven, and it's put on the seat and on the back, and basically to let the air flow. So when you sit on the chair, it doesn't get hot. The furniture breathes. And so chair caning, it was real popular 100 years ago. Now it's mostly in antiques, but that's real stuff. It's gluing real stuff onto the painting. And he glued this rope around the edge. And they're really starting to question the idea of what is real and what is illusion. And the whole point is that it really doesn't matter. It's what you see is what matters. And in this case, Picasso's not making a rectangular or a square painting. He's doing this in an oval, and he's using other materials. And sometimes these cubists would paint images of things that could be pasted onto the surface, that JOU. That's a reference to the journal, which is what they call a newspaper, and it basically Le Jour, the day. Bottom line, this is a headline banner, but instead of cutting it out of the paper, he's painted it on. So yeah, it's about a new way of making art. And that was really, really important to these artists, because what we had was a brand new century. We had modernism. We had things that never existed before. By 1913, we have airplanes. People can fly. We had railroads. We had things like the Eiffel Tower. We had motion pictures. We need to have an art that rises to this level. And so here I was telling you about Leisure on the Picasso here. On this George Brock, he actually takes bits of newspaper and pastes them right on the surface. And it's all pasted on paper. It's not on canvas, but he's doing a drawing using some of the same techniques. And he has various images. This image here of what looks like to be a doorway. Some newspaper, they liked it because it was flat, it was printed, and then the rest of the drawing. And so I keep talking about this being modern, modernism. And I want to ask you to think about it this way. If it is modernism, the premium, the value, the emphasis is on modern, which means new. And so what we get here is a series of these isms, too many to remember unless you've been like me and living it for all these years. Lots of isms in modernism, but the premium is on the new. And so everybody is trying to do something new. And if you're doing something new, it's got to be different. And so we see this explosion. We see that start in post-impressionism, where people start moving on their own and doing different things. But after the turn of the century, we have many, many art movements. We have many different ways of making and thinking about art. And it's all about the new. And if it were retro, if you will, most of the time it didn't get much attention because it wasn't new. It wasn't modern. And so this is Brock and Picasso. Think about all of the descriptors I've mentioned about the paintings. This is a maquette for a guitar, it's titled this way. And he's kind of taken this cardboard and cut out pieces, and he's turned this guitar sort of inside out. And he's rearranged the pieces in a way. This was actually made. This is the cardboard study for guitar. But bottom line is that even the sound hole is kind of turned inside out. And if you see the actual sculpture, you'll see it kind of looks like a tube sticking out. But this is what they did. They took things apart, put them back together. And so then they move away from all of this analytic cubism and start to reintroduce color and pattern. And so this is three musicians from 1921. It's actually at the Museum of Modern Art again. And so you get these little shapes. They kind of represent things. See the little hands on what here was maybe a clarinet, guitar. See the music stand, the notes, three musicians. And so that's Cubism, the idea that you can take it apart, put it back together any way you like it. And so I put a star by this one too, and I have a Prado Museum poster in my living room with this image on it. I like Picasso. Picasso, Guernica. This painting has a story. It's maybe one of the more famous works of art of the 20th century. And it's about war. And if you take a close look at it, you see a lot of symbolism. You see over here dead people. We see the bull being a representation of Spain. Spain and the bull are synonymous, kind of like America and the bald eagle, you know. And so Spain, you see back end of a horse here, a horse over there, people yelling, desperation, coming out of the sky, ghost, if you will, agony. And you see this. Let me show you this little part. It's basically a flat area with these little marks, these little vertical marks on it. And it, in its own way, is a representation of newspaper, a newspaper article or newsprint article. So let me shift gears and tell you how this came about. By 1937, Picasso had almost throughout the world been recognized as one of the great geniuses of art. Not everybody liked Cubism. Not everybody understood Cubism. But there was an idea that Picasso was the genius of the century. And we were doing that in the 1930s. Likewise, in physics or science in general, we had Einstein, who was the symbol, the epitome, the icon of genius in the sciences. And so what we have these figures that are, at the time they would say, larger than life. And they were recognized universally as the best, the smartest, in Picasso's case, the greatest artist of his time. And so being from Spain, he still had a lot of feelings about Spain, his homeland, his culture. And in 1937, Spain was in the midst of a civil war. Actually, it was a three-sided civil war. It was the Republicans, it was the fascists, and it was the communists. And basically what Spain became with those three factions was kind of a proxy war for other governments and other emerging powers on the world stage. The communists were backed by, guess who? Joseph Stalin. The Republicans were finding themselves being supported by a lot of people that believed in democracy. And the third, the fascist, was headed up by a guy named Francisco Franco, General Franco, and he was kind of a dictator. He was a dictator alongside his contemporaries, Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. And so Franco actually won that war, if you will, but how he did it was horrific. And one of the ways that Franco won this war was by getting weapons from Hitler and Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany was preparing for war, which they would launch spring on the world 2 years later, but they were developing their airplanes, their bombs, their machine guns, their cannons, their tanks, all of this stuff that you use to wage war. They just gave it right to Franco. Everybody else, they're fighting with ordinary rifles, they're fighting on horseback, and Franco just wipes them out. Hitler supported Franco, to be sure, but what they had in mind was that they wanted to test the viability of the weapons they were developing. And you could see in real time, under battlefield conditions, how well these weapons worked. And so it was kind of beta testing for Hitler and Mussolini, and it was a way to win the war for Franco. And one of the most outrageous, disturbing atrocities of that war was here in Guernica. And they used Guernica to see what their weapons could do, because Guernica had been pristine. It was what they would call a pristine target. It had not been bombed. It had not been there. It was in, if it was a car, you'd say it was in mint condition. So anyway, Franco, with Hitler's weapons and a lot of Nazi advisors and technicians, they just leveled this town, Guernica. And that is the subject. And that was the story. And so Picasso, being the world's most famous artist, used this as an opportunity to make a statement against war. And so here he is. Here's Picasso painting down in the corner. Here is a picture of Guernica in progress. And you can see, as I was, it's 11 and a half feet high and 25 and a half feet long. So it's huge. It's epic. And this is it. This is in progress. And basically, he opened up his studio and let the world watch him put this painting together. It was well documented as he was painting it, and it was documented by design, because Picasso wanted the whole world to know about what happened in Guernica. And so you see these pictures like this of Picasso in the various stages of completion of this painting, and they appeared in things like Life magazine, and they appeared all over the world. And so it has become one of the great artistic statements against warfare, against killing and the brutality of war. And so there's some of these areas here too. You can see he actually changed as he painted this. This is not in the painting. I'll show you. He changed it. The light, the lantern, and so on. This was something different. But anyway, and here is a picture of Guernica. And this was the kind of destruction that armies could do. And they could do it quickly. They could take a whole city and just level it. And so the gruesome subject of war. I want to add this too. It's not the only people that have blown up or destroyed entire cities and large populations. The United States did that with the atomic bomb in Hiroshima, Japan. And that too was a pristine target. There are a lot of theories about why they bombed Hiroshima, since it had very little military significance. But the bottom line is that was a pristine city that had remained untouched by the war. And you would know, after they dropped that bomb, all of the things that were destroyed by that atom bomb. They could come in, and they did. They brought people in, measure the destruction, the casualties, see the kind of injuries inflicted, the number of, anyway. And this is a Picasso from the St. Louis Art Museum. And it is a still life. And this actually is from around the same time. What happens with Picasso is, like I say, he keeps painting and making art until his death in 1972. But he kind of does a lot of different things along the way. And one of the things that he is doing here is playing with automatic drawing. And that is where the artist, the creator of the work, kind of does a free form line drawing where you just kind of follow your instincts. You just start moving your arm around. And in this case with Picasso, he comes back in and puts the fruit, the leaves, the vase in there. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to surrealism. And so what's happening with Cubism does not just stay with painting. There's a lot of Cubist influence in a lot of stuff, but there's some Cubist influenced sculpture. Alexander Archipenko, woman combing her hair. And so you see, it's kind of interesting because the negative space here actually defines the woman's head. Jock Lipschitz, this is from the Nelson Atkins in Kansas City. But you see, bather, and this is really, if you want to talk Cubism, Lipschitz actually really broke the subject matter into blocks. And this is how Cubism, this is kind of the genesis of the name Cubism, is that a lot of people were approaching it like that. Like I say, take subject matter, take it all apart, put it back together. And if you will, it's like Lego. Julio Gonzalez, take the subject, pull it apart, put it back together on your terms. And so here's another offshoot of Cubism. And you can see it's a little bit more design oriented, if you will. You see the circles. This is called Homage to Blériot, and Blériot was this guy. He was an aviator in the early part of the century. He was the first guy to fly across the English Channel in an airplane. Of course, you see the date, 1914, that aircraft are really primitive, but he was kind of like their Charles Lindbergh, some 13 years prior. And so anyway, this was called Orphic Cubism, and Delaunay and his associates were finding that light could be broken up into its component colors. We know that now. They knew it then too. But the idea of breaking up the color and putting it back in a circle or something resembling a circle was what they were really interested in. And so we get these little images. There's another airplane here, the Eiffel Tower, a symbol of modern, a propeller, and these overlapping, multicolored, almost the entire visible spectrum put together, the light broken up and put on the canvas. And so Orphic Cubism, he did another one too. This is not the Orphic Cubism, but the Red Tower. And it is, like I say, Eiffel Tower was the big symbol of the modern. And so he's breaking this up. He painted it red and put it back together on the surface. Cubism. Then there's this other adherent, and that is Ferdinand Leger. And he's kind of doing the same thing. He's kind of interested in flat. He's kind of interested in color. He's kind of interested in putting things back together on his terms. But he is really kind of more interested in the dehumanization of modern culture. And so you see, this is the city. Look at these. These are figures going up and down the stairs. So done in 1919. You see, there's a sign here, kind of predictive. It's kind of a shape. Kind of looks like something of a modern day restroom sign, but it's depersonalized. It's mechanical. And Leger does this kind of work. Here's another one too. I put the star by this one. The three women. And it's kind of like Cubism, at least in a lot of ways, influenced by Cubism, the flat space, taking the shape, putting them back together in your own way. But this idea of dehumanizing people in this industrial modern culture. And I'll show you a parallel here. And these are two posters from Fritz Lang's Metropolis. It's a film done by German producer-director Fritz Lang. And it is about the same thing. And this is from 1927, but this is a real concern at the time. And you see, it's got a lot of modern art influence on it. And you see here, this is 1927, it's 50 years before Star Wars. But the idea of dehumanizing people. That's Ferdinand Leger. A lot of people seem to find his work cold, but that's deliberate. It's about that. It's about dehumanizing effects of modern life. And so yet another offshoot of Cubism is this. It's called Futurism, practiced primarily by the Italians. It was an Italian movement, and it was about movement and dynamism. And in fact, that's what they would tell you. They wrote all kinds of manifestos about futurism, and it's really very much the modern. Unlike taking sort of a cautionary or antagonistic stance towards the modern and dehumanization, futurism embraced all of that. So it's the other side of the coin, if you will. And they liked their movement. Giacomo Balla, Dynamism of a Dog on a Leash from 1912. And it's a painting. And you see what it is. It's a woman walking her dog, presumably a dachshund of some sort. And you can see she's got a long dress, and you see the feet moving, you see the chain moving, you see the dog moving. That's dynamism. And that's what they embraced, the idea of movement. And of course, it looks kind of quaint in this day and age, but the idea of capturing movement was something that was not really attempted in any significant way in painting before this time. We see that, and if you were to do this today, you would probably use a slow exposure camera to create this image. But bottom line is movement, dynamism, the future. Umberto Boccioni, unique forms of continuity in space. And this is a walking person. And you see all of the forward diagonal shapes that all kind of point to various parts of the movement, kind of like how this shows you all of the movements of the legs and the tails. This is the movement of the legs, the feet, the arms. Movement. Gino Severini, 1915. This is after the First World War actually starts. Armored train. And you see this. We got a train, and we see all of this kind of cubist effect here, all of this broken imagery put back together. But we do see right through the center of this, we got soldiers shooting their rifles, and we see this large cannon. That was the epitome of strength. It was an epitome of modern warfare. It was dynamism. It was the future. Of course, the idea of this being a train has some setbacks because you can only go where the rails are. And if he were to do this today, he'd probably have some Abrams tanks shooting and all of that. But for the time, it was about the future, about movement, about speed. And there are a lot of these paintings that'll show bicyclists going really very quickly, multiple images, race cars, any airplanes, anything that would move or fly. They loved it. And as a footnote, Mussolini, the villain I described a while ago in the Spanish Civil War, he was the dictator in Spain, and he was actually the progenitor, the original fascist, if you will. And he embraced this kind of art. This is the only time we see a dictator actually embrace modernism, at least for this part of the century. But he kind of liked that. It made people think forward, better, faster, stronger, etc. And then, like I told you, we're going to see so many movements as will make your head spin. And this one will make it spin farther and faster. Dada. And it really is about as nonsensical as its name. And we see Dada emerge during the First World War and afterwards. It kind of lasted for about 10 years. And there were a lot of motivations for becoming a Dada artist. It originally, it's been said, recorded, that it began in the Café Voltaire in Zurich, Switzerland, during the First World War. And Switzerland was neutral, and a lot of people wanting to escape fighting in the First World War went to Switzerland. And a lot of the artists got together, and by most accounts, and I hope you can sympathize with this, they thought what was going on in the world was crazy. Here we got these massive armies all over Europe. They're killing each other by the tens of thousands. They're using weapons heretofore unseen. They're using machine guns, poison gas, airplanes, tanks, all of this stuff. And it's just a big killing field. And at the time, they called it the Great War because it was the biggest war to that point in history. And so anyway, there were these people in Switzerland. And they started doing, because the world was crazy, they were kind of doing crazy, nonsensical things. And they were doing things like what they would call a Dada theater, Dada a play. And the characters would dress up in more or less nonsensical costume and have a nonsensical dialogue, sing nonsensical songs that have nonsensical harmonies, which means it was like not harmonious at all. And so they were like kind of doing everything against all of the rules. And the idea was that if all of these rules were so good, effective, look what it got us. The world is destroying itself. And we're going to protest. And it was kind of a protest. And they called this anti-art. Dada, anti-art, same thing. And so that's how it started. It kind of spread. There were some Dada artists that were working out of New York, and later out of Paris, and later out of Germany after the war. But for the time, they were doing anti-art, nonsensical art. And so this is Jean Arp. You see it in parentheses there, Hans. He was a German, but because Germany was such a villain in the First World War, he changed his name to the French pronunciation, Jean. Collage arranged according to the laws of chance, torn and pasted paper. And basically what he did was throw this piece of gray paper on the floor, tore up pieces of black paper, and white paper and just threw them down. And where they landed is where he pasted them, arranged according to the laws of chance. And this stuff began as kind of a protest. It was kind of the nonsensical thing. This will develop in time into surrealism, and because they start to address the questions raised by what is chance. But before we get there, I'll show you some other things that were Dada considered anti-art. Marcel Duchamp, fountain. He took a urinal, signed a pseudonym, R. Mutt. Duchamp was kind of a character. He had all different kinds of names that he signed and that he called himself. But this was a urinal, and he put it on a pedestal and presented it as sculpture, titled it Fountain. And you see, this is a replica from 1950. The original was just thrown out because when he did it, people were not amused. And the people running the gallery just threw it out in a dumpster. Marcel, don't do this again. But what happens with Duchamp is that he actually starts to raise some questions about what is art, who decides what art is, what does art say, and can art be something that's already made? And in fact, he didn't, this being one of his more famous, the urinal, but he would do things like put up a coat rack, a snow shovel, other objects. He had a bicycle wheel inserted on the top of a stool. And it was all anti-art, but it started to gain some traction. You raise some philosophical questions. What is art? And so here's another one of his most famous ones. This is at the Philadelphia Museum as well. I'll show you that. That's where this one is too. The greatest collection of Marcel Duchamp is at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. But here it is, a postcard of the Mona Lisa. And he draws a mustache, a little beard, and writes some letters on the bottom, LHOOQ, and signs his name to it. Now, Marcel, why in the world would you do something like this? Think about it. Anti-art. What would be, at the time, considered to be the most important work of art in the Western world? And there are some pretty good answers to that question, but one of them certainly would be Da Vinci's Mona Lisa. And so he's taken a cheap copy of it and basically marked it up, defamed it, did something that could be sacrilegious in a sense. And so anti-art, actually, I'll show you this one again. It was a survey in the early part of the 21st century among artists, among scholars, among curators. What is the most important sculpture of the 20th century? This. This is what came out number one. Maybe in part because of its historical value, but the idea that Dada comes along and makes us rethink what is art. And in light of this, and this is modernism, and we got futurism and cubism and all that other stuff, art is definitely moving forward. As I said in the introduction to modernism, the premium is on the new. We're not looking back so much as we are moving forward. And the past, well, she can get a mustache and a beard. And this is another piece, one of his later works. Actually, Duchamp lived until about 1966 or 68, but he stopped making art. And but he made this, and it's called The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelor's Even, the large glass. And this has a whole story behind it, and it kind of comes out of a lot of things that Duchamp had done up to that point. And so it's like two big double panes of glass and this stuff in the middle. And it's got a story behind it. And this is the bride, and this is her bachelor's. And this here is a thing, it's called a chocolate grinder. It was something that Duchamp used a lot in his work, and it was kind of the essential mechanical object. And especially when we got people like Sigmund Freud talking about the relationship between machines and human sexuality. He would talk about how machines are based on a sexual model. For example, your outlet here, you got a male that you plug into the female that's in the wall, sexual. Anyway, these are representative of the bachelors, and if you knew the cultural currency of the day, you'd see one is a postman, one's a butcher, etc. One's a bishop. And this is the bride. And if you want the whole story, you really kind of need to look it up. But I do want to tell you about this piece up here. Anybody have an idea what that represents? Nobody. It's an antenna. This was the early days of radio. And instead of having a tower antenna, basically what were used as antenna were these sheets of steel that were cut into squares. And it's not a sheet of steel per se, it's more like chicken wire or a weave or something. But at any rate, at the time you would recognize this as radio antenna. Technology changes. But at any rate, that's Duchamp. And Dada spreads through some other areas. And you can see on this one by Hannah Hake, Dada, Dada, Dada. And it's a collage. And it says, cut with the kitchen knife, Dada, through the last Weimar beer belly cultural epoch of Germany. They pick up, after the war, these German artists pick up on this anti-art thing, and it's largely a protest kind of art. It's not made according to the rules. And in this case, it's called a photo montage, but you could call it a collage as well. And so it's about the corruption, about the degradation of the German culture. It's about all of the hardships foisted on the German people as a result of an unnecessary and senseless war. So again, we see anti-art being driven by world events that absolutely make no sense. And so one of our colleagues, Kurt Schwitters, he just starts doing collages, and even doesn't really have the political import. It's more, we would understand this today as basically an abstract design, and it's about color, it's about texture, it's about, I like this piece especially, it's a rice paper over the top of it, but basically it's printed material for the most part, and it's put together as a collage, but it's not a collage of something as much as it is just a collage. Because what's happening here is that artists are starting to question the idea of actually having subject matter in their work. We're starting to push the brushwork, the color, the texture. We're taking the subject matter apart and putting it back together. And some are saying, why can't the materials themselves be the subject of the work? And so I've been talking a long time. Ahem, ahem. Any questions? Does this make sense to you? I'm trying to make it make sense. And if you were to look at it in a particular way, it may not make any sense at all. But it does, and it is the art. It is the art of our culture, the art of our times. No questions. Well, in that case, I'll see you guys on Wednesday. Enjoy the beautiful weather and be safe. Adios.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Robin.